we absolutely go for hard science. But when we do science, we don't just simply do the science. We have ceremony, we have song, we have drumming, we create inventive new words in our language to encompass and adapt to these ever evolving ideas. And it's that that makes it quite different from simply, picking up a lab coat, working with a beaker. You can have all that. We have tribal schools that do genetic bioengineering, but what becomes more important is going back to Aki, going back to the land, being a part of the land.
Hi, Greg.
Hi.
Tell us what your story, a little bit of quick intro, your story. What do you do?
Well, I'm an Anishinaabe from several nations, Garden River Nation on the Ontario, Canada side, and Bay Mills Nation in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We Nish love to wander around, go off to different places, travel all around. I think that's why science fiction is so appealing to us with the possibilities of time travel and other things. What I really work on, though, is Indigenous Futurism, which was a term that I coined back in 2003. A lot of people think it's 2012. Because that's when I put out the anthology Walking the Clouds, Indigenous science fiction. What I was really interested in doing is, as an academic, you're supposed to write a monograph. You're supposed to write a book analyzing stories or whatever it is. And it just didn't feel right to me. It felt like, as Indigenous people, we had been doing all kinds of stories that lent itself very much to science fiction, to the fantastic, to horror, all of those kinds of things.
So when you first start to think about an anthology, I guess my first thought is do all the people that you're thinking about putting in there, do they write things down in English? Do you have to rewrite them? Do you have to listen to stories and then put the stories down? How do you get them into the right form?
That's a very interesting question, because a lot of us, of course, have been colonized enough that we have English at least as a second language. And one thing that's become a pattern with so many forms of Indigenous futurism is what Helen Hegg Brown, she's Chakotay, did a short film called The Cave in 2012. I'm turning it into English. It was entirely in Chakotay with subtitles in English. And as she talked to me about it, because she had been given a Lars von Trier experiment, where you're told to get out of your comfort zone and do something that you don't normally do. And Helen Hegg Brown, her mother and her grandmother, are known for working with revitalizing language, creating documentaries of Indigenous feminism, things of that nature. So she turned to me for the science fiction, and she was like, I've been asked to create a science fiction film. And I'm not sure how to go about it. And I didn't want to, tie her in or give her categories or give her labels. And so I was just discussing a lot of things that had been happening. And then she said, oh, I get it. We're taking the fiction out of science fiction. And that actually has become a kind of mantra, because when we write stories, such as, let's say, Wobshageg Rice, who's an Anishinaabe, and wrote Moon of the Crusted Snow, and it's working very much with climate change, with climate crises, and then how as a community do you respond to that? And in this case, as we now often experience, all the power was out. There was no way to communicate otherwise, right? And he writes a story set very much in the future, but the actions that are done within the community, such as deciding that as they run out of food, that there will be hunters that go out and get moose or buffalo or deer. And what they do is they bring it back to the community. And the ones who are first served, first taken care of, are the elders. They're right. Given the best parts and they're taken care of. And then it becomes split up. And an important feature of Nish thinking, or Anishinaabe thinking, is that even with our enemies, if we have enemies, that during a time of crisis, there is to be love and generosity and giving. And so you actually make a point of going to an enemy after the elders and giving them your gifts, giving them your manunum, your rice, your wild rice, your maple syrup, and other things, such as in our nations, which goes very much against federal government of the US or of Canada. We are called the pacifist anarchists. We actually don't have a hierarchy. And so we don't have a chief. I mean, in the process of colonization, there have been chiefs that have been given to us, or tribal councils given to us. But the people that are recognized in the community quietly as leaders are the ones who stay in the background. They're the ones that are giving very quietly without needing acknowledgement. And everyone in the community grows up knowing that. And so they honor and revere that person.
So, this writing that we're talking about, hasn't it been going on for 1,000 years before? And then you come to this point and you say, well, now we're going to try and jump into this box that's called science fiction. And do people look at you like, well, geez, how do I do that? What's the, that part like?
That's a beautiful, beautiful question. And it's actually why I backed away from science fiction and followed the tradition of Afrofuturism. And I want to really give credit to Alondra Nelson, who now is, a famous person working for President Biden.
Right.
But actually, as a scholar and a scholasticist, she put together in 2002 a series of scholarly articles, and it had all been started with online social media and conversations back and forth, asking this very question that you're asking. Are we using a colonizing tool by even investing in science fiction? Because much of science fiction is a colonizing tool and about contact and about what you do with the alien and the other, and what are the techniques that you use to exploit the natural resources, et cetera, right? I mean, science fiction in the late 19th century grew right alongside the Industrial Revolution. And so it took on a lot of those components. Futurism, in the way we mean it, is not at all the Italian fascist art futurisms. It's really important to recognize that. Afrofuturism, which started first and was really established in 2002, talks about stories that are of body, soul, and mind. Now, at the time that Afrofuturisms got going in 2002, and then I had a tenure track job that Ursula K. Le Guin very kindly supported me for. She wanted a native scholar in the science fiction area, and we loved her dearly, and she has passed on now.
What was she like?
Oh my goodness, Ursula, I spent many, many times with her. She had such a generosity of spirit, such a witty intellect. There were times in conversations where I'd think back over it and then really start laughing, because I had missed a bit of her wit. And she's written essays, where she grew up with Robert Oppenheimer, running around the couch and listening to conversations with he and her dad. But she also had 2 Indian uncles that stayed with them. And she didn't write about it until much later in her life. She had conversations with me all the time about it. But those 2 Indian uncles really, really impacted her. And excuse me.
Are you getting lost? Did you lose?
I keep losing the little. Oh, here we go.
When you were with Ursula, did that ignite your imagination for these, sort of alternative histories, earthsea, kind of things? Did that lead you into this path that you're so far down into now?
Yes, maybe better put, because when you're niche and I went straight to California, LA, Hollywood to get schooling, and I had never seen a TV. I had never seen a film.
Right.
I came from the bush.
Right.
Where we had, no running water or pipes or electricity or things like that. So it was really a shock. And what Ursula is so wonderful at with so many people, not just myself, is that she quietly draws you out and gives you confidence to go forward. In fact, I had even asked her to write a foreword for Walking the Clouds. And she said to me, "Oh, no, Grace, no. As much as I would love to, make sure that you keep it Indigenous voices centered." And I'm so grateful to her for that now. Angelica Gorodischer, who is a writer in Argentina, and Ursula actually translated her stories into English with help. She was always doing that. She was always finding areas around the world globally that maybe were not in English that could be translated and could give a sense of, in that case, the horrible political regime that Angelica lived through with all of the disappearings, and the fact that even writing something too bluntly could get you disappeared or thrown in jail. And so there, science fiction was used as a veil, as an allegory, so that you could talk about things in the future, about what was really going on currently, right? But then they couldn't pull you away from that, because you could say, well, actually, this is an imagined future, or this is an imagined alternative world. So there, in many places in Latin America that she helped out in, they were using it as a veil. And she actually suggested at one point that science fiction is the allegory of the 20th century.
When we say science fiction, is that a way of being able to say things that are uncomfortable from a human rights perspective? If you just wrote a story that was a human rights story, if you label it under science fiction, does that make it easier to say things that make people uncomfortable?
It could be, and I also think that almost the label of science fiction has quietly faded away. John Reeder, a very dear friend of mine, who's just written absolutely wonderful books on, is this a genre or what is this, said, and many of us have adopted his way of thinking, and he works with Native Hawaiians at the University of Hawaii. It's really not a genre. It's more like it's become a family of resemblances. And we really picked up on that because the family of resemblances really are different. Like when you read an Afrofuturistic text that is written from the perspective of someone, that's the important thing about all the futurism. It's always written by the author who has that perspective, who has that culture, who potentially has that language. Allies can help out by promoting the books and the artwork and other things, but it's not really a futurism unless it's written specifically from, let's say, a Malaysian who is losing their island, and it's a trans story, and they're mutating into coral,
Right.
becoming symbiotic with coral. And that's an interesting feature because do you call that science in the sense that Frederick Jameson talked about? Hard science? Oh, I should say this. We absolutely go for hard science. But when we do science, we don't just simply do the science. We have ceremony, we have song, we have drumming. We create inventive new words in our language to encompass and adapt to these ever-evolving ideas. And it's that makes it quite different from simply, picking up a lab coat, working with a beaker. You can have all that. We have tribal schools that do genetic bioengineering, But what becomes more important is going back to Aki, going back to the land, being a part of the land. So that's where the land back movements have actually come from idealists in Indigenous futurisms.
In class, when young kids come to your school, they might be looking at a genetic class, like they want to understand the evolution of their genes going back 1,000 years, right? And then they come to your class, they don't necessarily know what it is. They don't know what those genes are. They don't necessarily know what their culture is. How does it feel when they realize how important this is just as important as looking at their genes? And this is another way of studying their past. How do you see a light come on in their faces?
Oh, they become so excited. I'm like Cornell West in the sense that he loves to teach freshmen. And I love to teach freshmen too, along with my grad courses and other things that I'm doing, partially because of what you have just suggested, which is that they're really grappling with their identity and kind of wondering, and often are biracial or triracial and are searching, and they thirst for these images. And what I do is, as I give them the history, because that can be pretty, it can wound. Jijigog is what we call it, where you have this open wound that as you hear things and take things in, your wound starts opening, right? And how do you heal that wound? And so the way I heal the wound is by giving them all these stories in the future. Because part of it is, like, let's say for students from Kuwait, we have a lot of international students from Syria, Kuwait, just all over. And what they end up doing is they end up getting inspired to write their own stories, because this is always an option, is not just to listen and take in stories and analyze and talk about it, but to create their own. And currently there's a Kuwait poetry circle that is now worldwide, and many of my students from my class became so excited about all the futurisms, where you have spirit, body, soul, and mind. And you can talk about those things, as opposed to with cyberpunk in the 1980s, it was all about mind versus body, and how can we upload our minds, and how can we get away from our meat and our flesh and our bodies. And in some ways, I think futurisms was a really wonderful reaction to that displacement of body and emotion and feeling and taste and smell and all of the things that are a part of our lives, right? And it allowed opportunities to open up in that kind of way.
Grace, this has been incredible. For those of you watching or listening, there's one thing, it strikes me as you're talking, and for me, the way I'm interpreting a lot of this, I love this word futurism. I do love the idea that you write your story, and maybe you write your story which has some healing in it, that maybe it takes you to a future you want. And so you're both, to the beginning of the conversation, you look at the past, where you are now, and where am I going? And it feels like there's a common thread there that is incredibly powerful, and that everybody has the story and everybody has the right to claim their story and their future. That's kind of what I'm taking away from this. So it's been remarkable to listen to you, and to where, people should look at your work. We'll link to, some of your ideas, your anthology, what you're doing. And we encourage people to kind of really find out about this incredible work that you're actually doing alongside all of these great people. It's incredibly inspiring.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time with us today. It was really a pleasure.
Oh, Shane and Gretch, thank you very much.